This is a report from the US Department of Justice. It's titled Klaus Barbie and the United States Government. When I stumbled upon this report the other day, I was like, Klaus Barbie, why is it so familiar to me? Then I remembered. Klaus Barbie was the villain of the movie Resistance. He was a ruthless Nazi in the movie. And since it was a true story, his character was based on a real person. A SS Nazi officer who was known as the Butcher of Lyon for having personally tortured prisoners as the head of Gestapo in Lyon, France. Obviously, you can't expect better than that from a Nazi, but what did the US government have to do with this guy? I was hooked. So, I started digging. The deep rabbit hole took me to thousands of pages of official reports and documents showing Barbie's involvement in the biggest crime cases of 20th century. He was responsible for Che Guevara's death, he was tightly connected to Pablo Escobar, and he was the founding father of a Nazi government years after Hitler's death. Yeah, that happened. And the glue that held all of these together was the US government. Barbie was on CIA's payroll the whole time, and he was not the only one. The story of Nazis in the CIA is the story of politicians, war criminals, drug lords, and revolutionaries. This is the CIA's Fourth Reich. May 22nd, 1945. Hitler's been dead for like a month, and Berlin is fallen. The Allies are 2 atomic bombs away from winning World War II, and all of the Nazi officers are on the run for their lives. Among these terrified officers on the run was this guy, Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen was the head of FHO, a branch of Nazi intelligence service who was in charge of spying on the Soviet Union. He was like a living database against the Soviet Union, and it was obvious they were after him when they conquered Berlin. Fearing the wrath of the Soviets and knowing that he knew a lot about them, Gehlen surrounded himself to CIC, Counterintelligence Corps of US Army. But why them? Cause Gehlen knew that although US and the Soviet Union were BFFs at the time, the tension between the two was so high, and the moment World War stuff was over, each side was gonna see the other side as a threat. So he threw himself at the CIC's arms. He told them who he was and what he knew. He also told them that he has dozens of microfilms containing all the information that FHO had on the Soviet Union. The information he had made him a valuable asset, so the CIC rescued him and saved him for the rainy day. And rain was on its way, a freezing cold rain. In 1946, Gehlen was told to gather a group of Nazis who were working with him in the FHO. The result was an intelligence agency named Gehlen Organization, located in the US-occupied West Germany and full of anti-Soviet Nazis working for the CIC and later the CIA. The organization was not that big of a deal at first, but then in the summer of 1947, it became a vital part of the US politics.
The gravity of the situation which confronts the world today necessitates my appearance before a joint session of the Congress.
On March 12, 1947, Harry Truman announced the Truman Doctrine to the Congress. And later in July, the US started sending about $400 million to Turkey and Greece governments to suppress the communist uprisings. From that moment, the United States officially became an anti-communist power, and the enemy title was passed from the Nazis to the Soviets. The Cold War was officially started. The real winner of the Cold War was not the US. Neither was the Soviets. It was the Nazis. America's anti-Soviet policies led to the newly established CIA turning to the Gehlen Organization, giving him a lot of money, power, and most importantly, immunity. Gehlen Organization became a safe home for the Nazis who were running away from their past and wanted to wipe off their bloody footprints. It was the starting point of the CIA hiring Nazis for anti-Soviet purposes. In a couple of years, there were hundreds of other CIA units who were working with the Nazis. It is believed that in the Cold War, US spy agencies used 1,000 Nazis. People like Kurt Georg Kissinger, a foreign propaganda agent of the Third Reich, who in the 60s became the Chancellor of West Germany, or Paul Dieckhoff, a SS member who became the president of Interpol in the 60s. It is pure hypocrisy. The head of the international police, who's there for international crimes, was an international criminal. Come to think of it, that's kind of the American dream, isn't it? Anyway, let's go back to where it all began. Klaus Barbie. Barbie was among these lucky Nazis. In World War II, he was the Gestapo chief in German-occupied France and was in charge of arresting, torturing, and killing thousands of people. His victims were mostly Jewish people, communists, and the members of the French resistance. Unlike other high-ranked Nazi officers like Eichmann, who was acting only as a bureaucratic boss giving orders, Barbie voluntarily tortured and murdered men, women, and children, and enjoyed every second of it. That was Barbie, a heartless sadist in a uniform. But unlucky for him, the war didn't end in Germany's favor. And in a blink of an eye, Klaus Barbie became the public enemy number one in France. Some of the French people hated him more than the Hitler himself. But he happened to leave France a couple of months before Germany's surrender, so they couldn't reach him when the war was over. After almost 2 years of playing hide and seek, he was captured by the CIC as a part of the Operation Selection Board. Long story short, the CIC hired him as an anti-communist agent in occupied Germany. While French authorities and surviving French resistance members were after him, he had the protection of the CIC and kept working for them without any problem. However, the pressure from the French and public reached its peak after a while. Almost everyone knew the CIC had Barbie. His case was becoming a diplomatic issue between US and France. When the French ordered his extradition in 1950, the US government got frustrated. If Barbie was gonna stand trial, it would raise a lot of questions. Everyone would know that he was on the CIC's payroll the whole time, and it was gonna be a huge embarrassment for the US government. And also, let's not forget that Barbie knew a lot, and I mean a lot. This is what Eugene Kolb, Barbie's supervisor at CIC, wrote in one of his memos. Due to his association with CIC, subject knows more about CIC's target, modus operandi, etc. than most CIC agents. The subject also knows the identity of most KPD penetration sources used by this office, due to the fact that he either handled those sources or because he recruited or turned such sources. So if they were gonna ask Barbie what did he do for the CIC, he was gonna leak some sensitive information, drop some names, and probably blow up the cover of the sources of the CIC in the Soviet Union. The US government was in a difficult position. They couldn't hand him over to the French and they couldn't kill him, so they went with the third option, sending him to the Nazi safe haven, Latin America. Barbie was sent to Bolivia with his family. CIC made his fake identity as a mechanic named Klaus Altmann. At the same time that the French government sentenced him to death in absentia for his war crimes, he was settled in Bolivia and started living as a free man. This could be the end of a story of a survived Nazi, but Barbie's story was just started. In fact, stuff he did in the Bolivia in the next years were a lot messier than stuff he did as a Nazi officer. So, let's see what happened. In Bolivia, he kept a low profile at first, doing some regular business, farming, hanging out with the local people, and almost anything a middle-aged man would do in his retirement. But everything changed in 1964. In November 1964, the CIA orchestrated a military coup against Bolivia's leftist government and put this guy, René Barrientos, in power. Barrientos was a US-backed right-wing politician, so he would definitely hate the communists. Unsurprisingly, he started capturing and killing the communists and anyone with a little bit tilt to the left. When Barbie observed that an anti-communist government came to power, he was like, I spent all of my golden years killing communists, so I can help with this new government. So he used his connections and got in touch with the government and joined them for all those commie killing operations. At the same time, Argentinian communist revolutionary Che Guevara was on his way to Bolivia. Che Guevara has already achieved success in the Cuban Communist Revolution and was on his way to exporting the revolution to other Latin American countries. At this time, the Cold War is at its peak, and after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US is furiously after Che Guevara. There was this huge communism boom in Latin America after the Cuban Revolution, and the biggest fear of the US at the time was more communist countries in its backyard. So, when Che Guevara came to Bolivia and started a paramilitary group against the Barrientos government, the CIA was using all of its assets to help Barrientos capture Che Guevara and get him killed. And after a couple of bloody conflicts, Che Guevara was killed and his uprising was suppressed. It is claimed that Barbie was the CIA guy who orchestrated the capture and execution of Che Guevara in 1967. After Che Guevara's death, Barbie became closer and closer to the anti-communist Bolivian government and started teaching them methods of torture and interrogation. He had gotten himself a name among the Bolivian politicians. In the late 60s, Barbie was hanging out with the Bolivian big guys, helping the CIA, and yelling Heil Hitler in German bars every once in a while. In the early 70s, the US faced the same problem. In 1971, a socialist president named Juan José Torres came to power in Bolivia. So the CIA went with the usual. Torres was overthrown by a bloody coup. This coup brought military dictator Hugo Bonzar into the scene. Bonzar was the super radical right-winger dictator the US needed in Bolivia. But the coup would be impossible without local intelligence support. They needed someone in Bolivia, someone with experience in coup d'etats and counterintelligence services, someone who is a friend of CIA and is trusted by Bolivian government. In other words, they needed Klaus Barbie. With Bonzar rising to power and Barbie as his anti-communist intelligence advisor, a reign of terror started in Bolivia. Communism was the original sin, and even thinking about it would get you arrested, tortured, and executed. The victims were not even political activists, they were teachers or workers who just wanted better working conditions or higher salaries. But in 1971 Bolivia, that was enough to get you tortured to death. And Barbie was the man executing all of these. Torture was like his craft, his art. He would enjoy designing and developing it. And with Bonzar giving him the green light, he was doing his best at it. However, Barbie was not just the government's boogeyman. In the 70s, he made some connections with drug cartels and started teaching them torture methods and military strategies. Cartels needed this kind of information and instructions to be able to fight with the other gangs and, God forbid, righteous politicians. He would also protect the cartel's supply chain. Cocaine is extracted from coca leaves. Back in the day, Bolivia was the primary source of coca leaves for cocaine cartels. The cartels of which Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel was the most famous. The man behind the coca leaf operations in Bolivia was this guy, Roberto Suarez Gomez. the richest man in Bolivia. Remember this guy in the Scarface? The Bolivian mafia boss who was super powerful and connected with the government? His character was based on Suarez. Barbie and Suarez started collaborating in the 70s. Barbie was a full package for him. A military advisor, a spy master, a powerful man with a huge influence on the government, you name it. Barbie and Suarez were making sure that the coca leaf supply chain for Colombian cartels was secure. Barbie also used his connections with the CIA to make some arms deals and make a career for himself as a weapons dealer. He had connections with the sellers, which were American or German firms, and the buyer, which was the Bolivian government and drug cartels. So he would just sit there and get his sweet piles of cash out of the deals. On top of it all, Barbie started his own paramilitary group named Fiancés of Death, a so-called secret society that believed in National Socialism. And in case you don't know, National Socialism is a sugar-coated name for Nazism. Fiancés of Death was the Nazi HQ of Bolivia. They wouldn't feel ashamed of using Nazi flags around their office, putting swastikas on the header of their official letters, or even signing them with Heil Hitler. So far, Barbie is connected to the CIA, Bolivian right-wing military dictators, arms dealers, and the cocaine mafia. And the cherry on top is that in the early 80s, all of these different units worked together to establish a Nazi government in Bolivia. Banzar left office in 1978, and for a couple of years, the power struggle created political instability in Bolivia. And in the 1979 election, leftist parties gained most of the votes. In the eyes of the Americans, Bolivia was on the edge of becoming a communist country. And it's the end of the 70s, so the US had enough problems of its own. From the energy crisis to struggling internal politics, with Carter and Congress having a love-hate relationship. So they couldn't afford another communist government in their backyard in this situation. So the CIA played the Barbie card again. Barbie was told to design a coup, but this time it was his coup. The plan was to overthrow the government, bring a military dictatorship, with Barbie pulling the strings behind the scene. And Barbie's plan was to use this coup as a catalyst to establish the Fourth Reich and be the Hitler of the new Nazi government of Bolivia. To be fair, there's no evidence showing that the US government knew about this plan. I mean, they told him to design a coup to lower the risk of the communist governments, but they probably didn't know that his alternative was a Nazi government. However, the US didn't completely back this coup. They didn't provide the financial support. They told Barbie to go out and pitch your idea to whoever you want and get your coup funded, but we're not gonna pay for it. So he turned to his rich friends Escobar and Suarez. He told them that if they sponsor the coup, the new government will guarantee the protection of their coca leaf supply. And sponsorship they did. With the cartel's money, the US approval, and the military power of Fiancés of Death Nazis, the 1980 coup was on its way. The coup was operated perfectly, and the military general Luis Garcia Meza took power in Bolivia. But the whole thing started backfiring the moment it succeeded. It didn't take US officials long to understand what they have done. This coup was literally funded by cocaine cartels, and now they wanted their share, and they wanted it all. In return for their financial favor, Barbie and the new government gave them full access and protection. And with that came the rising power of cartels. Escobar and Suarez had so much influence on the Bolivian government that the 1980 coup is sometimes remembered as the cocaine coup. The government got neck deep in the cocaine trade, and it was like the cartels were running Bolivia. US officials didn't see that coming. 1980 was the start of the cocaine epidemic in the US, and the war on drugs was a serious issue for US government. So after a while, US government cut their support and started questioning Mesa's government. Needless to say, without the US government support, Mesa's government couldn't last and fell after 18 months. Soon after that, Barbie's lifelong dream of establishing the Fourth Reich vanished too. He lost the political support of the Bolivian government, and this meant that now foreign reporters could interview him without being scared for their lives. Without the government and the CIA backing him, it didn't take him so long to get arrested. He was sent to France to stand trial for his war crimes. Back in the 1950s, he was sentenced to death. However, his execution was impossible since a trial was happening in the 80s and the France didn't have the death penalty anymore. So, he got life in prison, which didn't take long because he died by natural death soon after that. Story of Klaus Barbie is just a teeny tiny peek at the whole story of Nazis being hired by the CIA. I tried my best to keep the narrative fair and simple enough for a YouTube video, but if you want to take a deeper dive into the story, feel free to check out the sources I put in the description. Thank you for watching.